2023 webinar series. We're really delighted to have Lisa Senecal with us today. Some of you may know she's the recipient of the Thanatic Ethics PhD Fieldwork grant. And one of the things that we require our recipients to do is to present in the webinar. So it's Lisa worked very hard. She made several trips to Malta using the funding we gave her. You know, and she was just saying that this was good because it pushed her to, she has a chapter of her dissertation out of this. So we're glad to help, and we're you know, delighted to have her present today. I'm gonna hand it over to Thomas to introduce her, but before I do that, I just want to say a couple of things. So you will be hearing about the two other webinars we're going to have this semester. So I'm just going to informally, the reason you haven't heard yet is because we're still kind of finalizing dates and abstracts and things like that. But we do have two speakers lined up. So the first one is going to be Robin Reinecke, who is, I hope I'm pronouncing her surname correctly. She is assistant research social scientist at the Southwest Center and assistant professor in the School of Anthropology at the University of Arizona. And she works on sort of issues of border deaths in the US-Mexico border. So she has sent us the title of her talk, and it's called Undocumented Disappearances, Bureaucratic Sensibility Along the US-Mexico Border. And her talk will be on March 17th. So you will be you know, receiving the abstract and details for that very soon. And our second or our third, our last webinar of this current series will be presented by Professor Daniel Folliard, who is he's a professor of history, he's a historian at University Paris-Cité. And he will be talking about what he calls sad trophies, or human remains in colonial contexts, so kind of the violence of these colonial collections of human remains. So please stay tuned for the announcement of those two talks. And I think all of you must know already that we are going to have our fourth workshop, workshop 4, Thanatic Ethics, in Montpellier in October 5th to 6th. So the call for papers is out for that. So please consider sending us your abstracts. We welcome those. And then the last point I wanted to make is about a section on the Thanatic Ethics website called Network News, where we put up, you know, any kind of announcements, call for papers, talks, seminars, anything that you want to send us, which is, you know, somehow related to Thanatic Ethics. So please keep that in mind. And anything you send us, we're happy to put up on that on our website. So that's it from me. I'm going to hand it over to Thomas to introduce Lisa.
Thank you, Bidisha, and thank you, Lisa, for coming and for this presentation. It's a pleasure for us. It's a great pleasure. It's going to be the first event of the 2023 for us. And as Bidisha has mentioned, it's just the first one of a long series. Lisa, yourself, you're going to present your work on Malta. You are an anthropologist and working on migration, PhD candidate, and you are at the University of Lisbon. And you work on the Maltese border, but not so much on the policy side, but rather on the side of the subjectivities of the migrants themselves, how they actually experience this border. Your work is at the intersection of race, class, and migratory spaces, and you focus on anti-racism, inequality, non-citizenship, representations, and cultural transformations. Lisa, I hand you over the floor.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Thank you, Badisha. And also Judith, thank you so much. I'm going to share the screen now. Let's see. And okay, great. Okay,
Yeah.
so, sorry.
Sorry, it's, yeah, perfect. We can see it. Thanks.
Okay, great. So first of all, I just want to say thank you all for taking the time to be here today. I appreciate having an audience and your feedback, because this is the first time I'm presenting Deathnography in what I think is its totality. So thank you for providing this space to think things through with you. So again, my name is Lisa Senecal, and I'm a PhD candidate at ICS at the University of Lisbon. And this webinar presentation, as Badisha said, is part of my responsibility and pleasure to the Fieldwork Travel Scholarship. So thank you for the material support and also the belief in this project. I'm really extremely grateful. So the way I'm going to structure this presentation is as follows. I'll give you an overview of my dissertation, and I'll key you into some of the aspects of the border that I'm focusing on in this study. And I'll also locate the project within the territorial relational divide that has been important and maybe vexing for border studies. Then I'll turn to a contextualization of Malta. And after that, I'll discuss my fieldwork in Malta and the adaptation of patchwork ethnography to the work that I've been doing. And then I'll present some of the most significant findings and interpretations from Deathnography. It's a study that relies upon ethnographic methods to further understand the regime of borders in Malta by examining border deaths of those who die crossing the Mediterranean en route to Europe. And in its most distilled form, this method seeks to counter enumeration as the dominant way of conceptualizing border deaths. And then I'll conclude by answering the questions that I posed in the abstract for this presentation with one alteration. I've refined the first question. So what is significant about border deaths in Malta? I've instead adapted it to why did I choose to look at borders from the perspective of death? I thought that it was less broad and that I could actually really address it. And I'll proceed with the rest. So how are border deaths treated and understood in Malta? How do border deaths relate to borders? And what do border deaths reveal about borders? So my PhD project, it's entitled Mapping Malta, a study on the regime of borders through structures and non-citizen subjectivities. And it's structured into three distinct self-contained but related ethnographies, which when taken together, reveal points of connection and disjunction inherent to the regime of borders in Malta. That is that aspects of borders that are transversal at times and other times exceptional. Its consistencies and its inconsistencies, basically. So Deathnography is one of these studies. The other two relate to border crossers who arrive in Malta in very different ways. Those who arrive extra-legally by boat and those who have obtained Malta's so-called golden visa through the individual investment program. And the ultimate goal of the project is to establish a global and nuanced view of the meaning of the multidimensional physical and conceptual spaces of engagement that coalesce as the regime of borders in Malta. We already know that distinctions emerge at the physical and territorial, as well as conceptual and relational spaces of this regime. And that there are direct consequences to these distinctions, differential practices, categorizations, experiences, potentials, and different realities emerge or are translated within those territorial and relational spaces and beyond. That's to say, both within the state and in places far from Malta's territory, one expression of the EU's external border. However, we don't know enough about the logics of the application which produce these distinctions and hierarchies. And this empirical research sets out to gather more granular information that can fill in this gap. So following Vacchiano, Passi, and Cresswell, I've established a disarticulation of the apparatus of the regime of borders into 4 constituent parts: the physical border, the institutional border, the conceptual border, and the experiential border. In practical terms, and specifically within the context of Malta, what do I mean? So the physical borders materialize as 5 BPCs, or border crossing points, and these points are in line with the EU Parliament and Council of Europe regulations, establishing a community code on the rules of governing movement of persons across borders. Okay, so in the case of Malta, there are 4 sea borders. Can you see if I move my mouse on the screen? Are you able to see where my mouse is?
Yes.
Okay. So in the case of Malta, we have Malta Freeport in Marshallock, that's here. We have Imjar Yacht Marina, which is actually in Gozo over here. We have Masida Yacht Marina, which is actually very close to Valletta, but it's in this area right here. And then you have Valletta Seaport, which is here. And then there's one air border, and that's in Lua, and that's where the airplane is there. And the international, Malta International Airport is that border. So that is how those borders, the physical borders, are materialized. But now there are 2 facts that sort of complicate this picture. So Malta's external borders relate to the external borders of Schengen. When I asked the representative from Malta's armed forces about how the borders of Malta relate to Europe's borders, this representative explained to me, quote, "The external borders of Spain are now the borders of Malta. There's freedom to travel for tourists and goods. The external border has become an island border," end quote. So here we have a deeply relational picture, specifically of the external borders. Schengen is connective in one way, encapsulating Europe as an island. What I think is obscured from this perspective of radical connectivity, though, and what's not clear from the perspective of those who are part of Schengen, is what about that which is external to Schengen, that EU, Africa, Middle East borderland? What kinds of connectivity or disconnectivity are assumed, projected, or practiced here, and how? So my research is pointing me toward the fact that these ambiguities seem to exist for people who are securely within Schengen space, but they don't seem to exist for people who crossed that border extra legally by boat, for example. Now, second, Malta has territorial waters. Okay, and I'm going to move the cursor again. These are the territorial waters here. And it has a search and rescue zone. Here's the search and rescue zone. Sorry, your pictures are in front of part of that. So it's that sort of big rectangle there. So Malta has jurisdiction over its territorial waters, right? And these are 12 nautical miles off the coast of Malta. But it also has this SAR zone, which is 260,000 square kilometers. This zone was inherited by the British after decolonization, and the space is so large because it related to the air and sea borders the British controlled. Now Malta has responsibility in that zone. But there are important distinctions between territorial waters and SAR zone in terms of various commitments, responsibilities, and jurisdiction. So not only does Malta's SAR zone overlap with Italy and Tunisia, both territorial seas of both states, but it also abuts Greek territory and territorial waters. And this zone even encompasses Lampedusa. So Malta is required to coordinate with EU states, Frontex, NATO, the African states in that region, and with SAR zones in that area. And in the interview with the representative from Malta's armed forces, one thing that struck me was the characterization of the high seas, or this SAR zone, or part of this SAR zone, as quote, a no man's land. It belongs to everyone and no one, end quote. So he stated that it was not on, quote, an institutional, but on a legal basis, states had the right to impede, end quote, without referring explicitly to pushbacks. But at that point, I circled back to the topic of innocent passage that we had discussed earlier, and he anticipated where I might be going. And he addressed pushbacks directly and by the term. He wanted me to understand that within the SAR zone, it would not be possible for a state to push back, that legally, Malta does not have jurisdiction in that zone. So my interpretation of this is that there's a kind of active crafting of ambiguity or doubt or potential elbow room, a la Daniel Dennett, right? Meaning that there's a space infused with possibility of choice, choosing differently. But that choice seems to be put onto migrants or smugglers. This interviewee even showed me a Facebook page, or a bunch of Facebook pages. He ended up sending them after the interview, of smugglers who he said were advertising their services, and he called them exploitations. But they don't accommodate room for the state to choose differently. And this is the part I don't understand completely. This is why I posit that the physical borders are more fluid than assumed than in the territorial relational divide. This has potential good-making properties, right? Backup, support, safety nets, and teamwork. But the other side of this is that no one entity is ultimately responsible. This ambiguity is extremely convenient, and it appears that the regime of borders is strategically and informally employed as a mechanism of domination within that zone. My conception of the institutional borders of Malta unfold into 5 subcategories. They are the legislative, the political, the bureaucratic, the securitarian, and the humanitarian. For this presentation, I'll focus on the bureaucratic and the humanitarian in the example that I provide. So this is to say that the organizational, technical, and administrative competencies that are used to sort and categorize people are the institutional border. There is a procedural change that several of my informants called my attention to that exemplifies this branch of the border apparatus, which can expand and contract. At some point in 2018, many non-citizens who had arrived extra-legally and had been living in Malta with documents that granted them international protection, the humanitarian border, found themselves in a position that went from being required to renew their documents yearly or every 2 years. For some, it had been like that for around 10 years or more, to needing to renew their documents every 3 months. So there's the bureaucratic border. My informants call it the yellow book. One explained to me, quote, "For years I've stayed here, work, sleep, you sleep. I haven't been able to travel for 4 years now. You can stay here and there's no problem, even go to the bank to take money. But every 3 months, they don't send you fast to change the work permit. You have 3 months and it takes 1 month or something. Every time you have to wake up to go renew the documents." And he still hasn't found a solution. Another informant in a similar situation told me that in Malta, informal channels are often the fastest and most effective. This is also how borders open and close, move over you, or can disappear altogether. The conceptual emotional border relates to the internalization of categorization and the internalization of borders. It relates to deservingness and hospitality, which has limits mostly predicated upon the basis of an exception, but always also predicated on an inherent assumption and distinction of that person or group not belonging generally. We can observe the opening and closing of the humanitarian border as operating on this basis. For more on that, I think Mavelli 2019 would be the citation to look at. I'm finding evidence in my research that the conceptual elements of the regime are not only about constructed legal categories, but they also relate to the ways in which these categories permeate thoughts as natural, not constructed, and ways of categorizing within the privacy of our own minds who is other, who is us, who might not yet be us, yet nevertheless maintains that potential. The borders are naturalized as a result of the internalization of the structure. The last part might be very unique to Malta. We're talking about a small island with a small population, yet that population feels spatially constrained, and most Maltese people have concerns about how migration is experienced, physically, culturally, linguistically, but in some contexts more than in others. The naturalized border results from structure being internalized and unquestioned. So here especially I'm thinking about Bourdieu and the concept of habitus, that the internalization of the structure is a collective subjective common to a social class, an integration of the objective and subjective elements, which I think gets at something about that slash between conceptual and emotional. It might be border feeling as much as it is border thinking. One of the experts I interviewed explained that when Syrians arrived by boat, quote, it was particular because most of the cases we get are from Africa, not from Syria. The first, challenge was, are they local? Because they have the same, you wouldn't know if they are Maltese or Syrian, to be honest. Same skin color, forget the skin color, but same clothing. And then another told me at the cemetery, quote, people, meaning migrants, are buried in the same manner as the Maltese, nothing different. And the representative from the armed forces explained that in the approach to a rescue, quote, there's nothing different because they are migrants. So this was a recurring theme, but I just want to emphasize here that people were keen to stress to me how little the fact that a person was a migrant impacted any given situation, that for them, it wasn't an issue, which seems to contain an inherent judgment about migration or, quote, the migrant. Hence, the conceptual emotional border relates to how border thinking, that is how the border speaks to people, influences people through formal representations, and that internalization, I think, how that is internalized or naturalized, that is where the emotional border exists, in that space of feeling or sensing where those border structures ought to be. And finally, the experiential border of Malta is a novel and perhaps experimental way of reframing or of thinking the border. The theoretical dimension that I want to explore empirically is how border crossing, interacting with, engaging borders is experienced differently. In order to fully comprehend what the border is, what it does, and how it operates, the lived and death experiences of those who encounter the distinct elements of the regime of borders must include the subjectivities of those who make these encounters. The subjective dimension of the border, how it's felt, experienced, encountered, negotiated, how the regime of borders is ingrained into the lives of these non-citizens and their experiences, all of this, I think, is paramount to perceiving and deciphering more deeply this apparatus. Despite wavering at times, I'm still optimistic that putting the experiential border on the table, so to speak, has the potential to transform the conceptual emotional border most of all. I still believe it's our myopia, our extrapolating that others' experiences must be similar to our own that prevents many of us from recognizing the multiplicity of borders, that borders can be found in places we don't find them, or found by us in places they don't exist for other people. At some point, I envisioned a resolution to the territorial relational divide that has emerged in border studies. The territorial perspective holds that borders and boundaries can be understood as stable, static, and solid, and that borders relate concretely, materially, even isomorphically with physical spatial territory. And from this viewpoint, borders are delineated markers or, quote, edges of space, even simple facts on the ground, or more radically, lines on maps. But from a critical perspective in border studies, the relational perspective responds to this rigorously territorial approach, stressing the contextual, fluid, dynamic nature of borders. I think the territorial borders are more fluid than we previously thought, and that the relational borders may be more fixed than we thought. That rather than a dichotomy, there's a fluidity and a fixedness within each of the constituent parts of the regime of borders. I think that getting clearer on where and why this fluidity and fixedness exists can give us more information about those differentials found at border spaces and the inequalities and privileges that transcend culture or relative space. The data that I've been collecting seems to point toward borders themselves as being mobile. Yes, people move across borders, but borders also move across people. I'm thinking about how in 2018, the law changed and renewal times changed, and the documents that would now be given changed. But borders moving over people can also be found in the failure to assist boats in distress. Borders move over people, and I believe this is something that as scholars of migration, mobility, and borders, we need to pay close attention. By surface area, Malta is the smallest of the EU countries. The current population is just under 500,000, and the land area of Malta is nearly 320 square kilometers or 124 square miles. Many Maltese people commented to me that they had family abroad and that there are more Maltese people living abroad than within Malta, but that the landmass is incredibly tiny, which gives you this feeling that the place is packed. It's the 5th most densely populated country on the planet. And this density and the traffic and this proximity is always on people's minds. Malta is a place of many contradictions. There's an English, British influence, a European influence, and an Arab influence. It's the middle place in the Middle Sea, etymologically speaking. But don't assume a fixity, more of a kaleidoscopic fluidity. There are many competing interests here. Vacchiano describes the region as an, quote, historical place of exchanges, clashes, creolizations, and divides. Muntz and Lloyd contend that the very construction of a region assumes a state-centric approach. Within this mercurial Mediterranean region, there are struggles, quote, over what is often called migration management that result in the placement of migrant bodies at the center of these struggles, end quote. And although the Mediterranean region, or perhaps the EU, Africa, Middle East borderland, remains in constant flux, contextually it provides a structural framing within which I'll capture the embodied realities that take place on a more granular level. The Maltese people perceive themselves as possessing a certain kind of adaptability and ability to borrow. This is part of a cultural imaginary wrapped in numerous cultural encounters. In an interview with 60 Minutes, which aired in December 2018, anthropologist and local newspaper columnist Mark Anthony Falzone agrees with this characterization of Malta as possessing, quote, a certain ingenuity, a certain scrappiness here, clarifying his agreement, claiming that, quote, scrappiness also means flexibility. And Falzone further explains that flexibility is related to, quote, a willingness to bend the rules, because the person who never bends the rules, they're thought of as a bit of a good boy. So Malta sees immigration simultaneously as a problem and a solution for its problems. Malta is perceived by its government and people as a territory of passage, a bus stop or a stepping stone on one hand. Falzone explains sub-Saharan, quote, boat immigrants in the Maltese imaginary are not perceived as settlers, but as people who will move onward. Quote, transience is a product actively and agentively produced by the state and other actors in response to a perceived threat from immigration. But on the other hand, the self-perception of Malta as a bus stop also aligns with and contradicts the aim of the Golden Visa program. Aligns with because at the inception of the program, there were minimal residency requirements, yet contradicts because those who defend the program claim that these newcomers are, quote, establishing real links to Malta. In an interview with 2 representatives from Identity Malta, the arbitrariness of conferring nationality came up in the conversation. One of them said bluntly, quote, "It is up to the ultimate discretion of the minister, right, of Home Affairs, and there is an open secret that there are internal policies that may appear to be arbitrary, but they are granted in an equitable manner," end quote. He turned next to the fact that contributing to the state was a factor. This, and then in a follow-up interview, characterized investments as a sacrifice to the state, helped me to theorize that the borders require or exact a sacrifice, some kind of capital from people. I've been unable so far to find any recipient of an investment visa who's willing to speak with me. When I asked these representatives at Identity Malta, now Community Malta, why they thought that was the case, one told me, "These are low-profile people. You won't find them." I ruminated on these words all day. Later in my field notes, I wrote, "These are low-profile people. So are people who migrate extra-legally. These are the most low-profile people." But there's no cavalierness in the discourse around that. Fear, security threat, yes. But in the end, both the golden visa migrant and the extra-legal migrant do not want to be known, do not want to be identified. In a sense, one to be ungovernable and the other to be just allowed to remain. What is significant about this connection-disconnection? How can we so easily see the same thing in such a different contextual way? By the time I should have been getting ready to start my field work, the whole world grinded to a halt. I was a single mom, relatively new to Portugal, and had become a Zoom butler for an 8-year-old, although almost old enough to do it alone, but old enough to still get into some tricky stuff if I wasn't looking. So my own work went to the back burner. I also didn't sleep a lot. I stayed up working on my project, reading, because I should have at least the theoretical part as on point as possible, right? And writing when I could, but with time and anxiety over the pandemic, and then all of that passed, and then I had all this anxiety about what am I going to do? What am I going to do for my fieldwork? So I found a few leads. By May 2020, the Center for Global Ethnography came out with some videos, and Sarah Pink's interview, Doing Ethnography Remotely, really resonated. I thought maybe I can get in there remotely. I'd lived in Malta before, and I was there in 2010, 2011, and again in 2013. But most of my friends that I'd kept in touch with were from football. Yeah, I played on a team when I was there, and many were no longer in Malta. I didn't make any contact with potential informants this way, but I managed to open up some leads and spaces to explore when I got back there. And then by the end of June 2020, Günel, Varma, and Watanabe published their manifesto for patchwork ethnography. And now this just blew the doors wide open. As a single mom in a pandemic, wanting to do in-country research and wanting to provide stability for my daughter, who was still learning the language in the country we had just moved to, well, the idea of conducting several short trips, getting in and getting out, getting back, or back in, getting back out, and again, well, this was appealing, bite-sized, intense, but doable. I decided to start putting real plans together. The first trip came together, and I would go alone. My daughter would travel as an unaccompanied minor to be with my parents for the summer. I organized summer camps for her in Vermont, and the day after she left, I was off to Malta. I was wondering, would it come together? There are so many things that can prevent a researcher from being able to spend long, uninterrupted months or years in the place where they're conducting research. Money, professional and personal commitments, life, responsibility, just to name a few. The list goes on. Go check out the manifesto. And patchwork ethnography gives a name to transformations that were already occurring within anthropology or notions of fieldwork. and, quote, intertwining of the personal and professional, the theoretical and the methodological in research. In my case, one thing that resonated deeply was this question of the distinction between field and home. Malta was my home at different points, and it had a special place in my heart. It always will. I'm still drafting a chapter of my thesis that I think I'll call My Border Crisis. It's me confronting myself and my time in Malta. And this is just to say that there's an aspect of my research that's deeply personal, but I'm not yet completely ready to go there. I think I will be, but I may not be. So I just need to see. I had online therapy set up. I had friends lined up. I had football lined up. I knew I was going to get into something that would confront me, but I also knew that this was the engine propelling my research. Many challenges arose, of course. Many things I wasn't sure would work did. I rolled with it. I got COVID while I was there. I was in quarantine for 2 weeks of a 6-week trip. I conducted interviews online. I took baths. I took naps. I called friends. They delivered groceries to me by sending them up the elevator. I still managed to, quote, get in there. And I had a better idea of how to reorganize things for when I returned. So we took the second trip in the summer of 2022. I brought my daughter with me this time. She went to swim camp and took music lessons. We visited places that were significant for our family. We explored new places. We went to the megalithic temples. She made friends. She hated it. She loved it. It was bonding for us. I didn't get everything that I wanted or planned done, but who does? Quote, patchwork ethnography refers not to one-time short instrumental trips and relationships a la consultants, but rather to research efforts that maintain the long-term commitments, language proficiency, contextual knowledge, and slow thinking that characterize so-called traditional fieldwork, while fully attending to how changing living and working conditions are profoundly and irrevocably changing knowledge production. Patchwork ethnography is not an excuse to be more productive. Instead, it's an effective but kinder and gentler way to do research because it expands what we consider acceptable materials, tools, and objects of our analysis. So field and home, making the field a home, returning home and bringing the field back with us. This is what fieldwork is and does. And when you study death, how can you not take it home with you? Some things just resonate too deep, and they're so close. It isn't a reason to shy away, and it isn't a reason to lean in. I think it's a way to expand. It carves us out so we might more deeply be with one another, be there for one another, more there for ourselves, more with our own self. Something that has changed in me is that I project less onto the people, the agents of the border, and understand that the way that things are organized is due to the structures. People are adapting to something that allows for violence. The sickness of the structure is what needs to be deconstructed. This is where I choose to put my energy. In an interview with Patchwork Ethnography from 2021, the authors clarified how the manifesto had been long in the works and emerged out of informal conversations between the researchers over many years. But somehow the constraints of the pandemic also provided a moment within which many people could relate. There's a later interview with members from the collective, and I want to read to you a quote from there because it encapsulates so much. And I need to say here that I was reminded of it because Amandine Desilets used it for a video project that she just finished, and I'll send it to you when I receive the go-ahead. It's a wonderful project. So, quote, in other conversations, patchwork emerged as a strategy for writing differently. One of our participants offered the provocative phrase that patchwork helps you, quote, make the seams visible. It foregrounds and highlights the moves of contextualization, decontextualization, extraction of data, the movement between field sites and home, and the various editorial decisions we make when we refine our stories. If the seams are visible, a very different ethnographic project and theorization can emerge. Now I want to take you to Deathnography and show you what emerged from this study. I'll limit my discussion to the fieldwork from Santa Maria Addolorata Cemetery, interactions and observations there, as well as an interview with Dr. David Varma, who shared the immigrant death register he established in 2005, as well as my unsuccessful attempts to obtain information and death certificates from the police and Identity Malta. I'll share the information I learned at the Islamic Cemetery at a later time, because when I return to Malta, I will follow up, and I believe that I'll have more information to share then. On several occasions, I went to Addolorata Cemetery. This was the first place that I started data collection for Deathnography. My first visit was on the 23rd of August, 2021. And after this trip, I knew Deathnography would not be what I had envisioned. In my field notes, I wrote this and even considered letting go of the study altogether. I didn't end up doing so, but I had many concerns. After this preliminary trip, I tackled my own presumptions and assumptions, my own border thinking. I'd presumed that there would be bodies of people who had died crossing the Mediterranean en route to Malta, buried at the cemetery. I assumed there would be the bodies of people identified as Christian or their faith unknown buried within the cemetery. And on this first trip, I established what I would describe as a reluctant contact who happened to be working in the burial administration unit on that day. There was a small window with a countertop and a half door that opens, but one must duck down to exit that area. So this contact came to the counter to speak with me, but I sensed that she was uncomfortable when I explained I was a researcher and that I had some questions. She told me that there were currently no bodies of migrants who had died in the Mediterranean en route to Malta buried in the cemetery that day, but that she recalled there were about 35 or 40 bodies buried in the cemetery 5 years ago. I'm going to try to go faster here because I am aware of the time. So she also mentioned to me that the cemetery was cleaned during COVID. And eventually she popped out under that half door to show me where the common graves were on a map that hung on the wall. She handed me a photocopied map, and eventually, quickly I left. I have to admit that I failed to follow up as much as I should have. I didn't feel that my questions were really clarified, and I felt a discomfort that propelled me forward to postpone the interaction. I was sensitive to the fact that we were also in the middle of a pandemic. And so I asked for an email address, and I said that I'd be going to the common graves section of the cemetery. And as I made my way through the cemetery, right, the common graves were located all the way in the back of the cemetery, on the margins, so to speak, but they're also centered around a central aisle. So as I sat there, right, the ethnographic hunch that I had, a la Sarah Pink, after this interaction and this walk through the cemetery, was that there was more to unearth. I wasn't satisfied with the narrative of my contact here, that there were many bodies buried years ago, but that there were none now. I couldn't know at the time what a baseline for the organization of the common graves was, and it was only after several more visits I could determine that at this time, the way things were was not common. It was an exceptional time. On my next trip, a pattern would begin to emerge. I could now confirm that I could be onto something with this hunch, yet I'm still thinking through how to interpret it. So when I got back to Lisbon, I contacted Dr. David Varma. He's the executive medical laboratory scientist at Modern Day Hospital. And I understood that he was responsible for creating an Excel spreadsheet entitled Immigrant Death Register. On the 12th of April, 2022, he sent this to me. And in January, he sent me an updated version. But it was at this point that I could now confirm in 2014, 32 bodies had been recovered from the sea and then buried in Malta. And in 2015, 25 bodies were recovered from the sea and later buried in Malta. So this could explain the narrative of my contact at the cemetery. However, as you can see, there were bodies recovered from the sea every year after that, and in most years after that. And those bodies had been buried in Malta. And according to this data set, since 2004, Only in the year 2010 were there no documented bodies recovered in the sea and buried in Malta. In fact, in an interview during my third trip to Malta in November 2022 with Dr. David Grima, he had explained that he started the register in 2005, but has kept records since 2004, when he said a pattern emerged. Quote, "I'm a scientist. I'm fascinated with numbers and data, you know." It was started in 2005. We saw that there was some form of a pattern. In the beginning, it was Asian people found at sea. We thought this could be something which we have to document apart from other cases. So this was, we thought this could be something, is now they're seeing a new migration. So we thought this could be something which we'd have to document apart from other cases. Categorize, I mean, in a sense, categorize. The pattern continued, not dramatically, but it continued. And then we did a retrospective study. We found actually we had the same events happening in 2004. So we went back to 2004, giving numbers to those as well. The body count started from 2004. It started in 2005, but retrospectively, we started with the 2004 cases. It proved us right, unfortunately. So on my second trip to Addolorata, I had more information at hand. And this information both became relevant and also complicated things. I was more prepared and relaxed. I sort of now expected that I'd be disturbing my contact there. And I was ready to sit with that discomfort. So this was the 5th of December, 2022. And I walked into the burial administration unit and I asked for my previous contact by name. I found out that she was no longer working there. But I sensed I was met by a new curiosity and skepticism, and this name dropping had established a slight amount of credibility. So I didn't share the death register yet, but I asked if there were any migrants buried in the cemetery. And like the contact from 1 year ago, this new contact relied upon well, his memory, I'll call it his narrative. He told me with confidence, the last time we had was 2016, 2017, 27 buried. I don't know, 2017, that was the last time. So then I showed him the immigrant death register, right? And then we started to, they went into their computers. I'm gonna try to go faster, I'm sorry, guys. So I told them that I knew that there would be, or I thought that there would be 2 bodies buried in 2021. And I asked if they were in the cemetery. They asked me if I had more information, if I had a month that they were buried or anything else. And I didn't have that, but I responded by saying, wouldn't they probably be the only unidentified bodies buried in the cemetery? And at this point, my assumption frustrated them. I'm going to read you how the exchange went. No, there have to have been much more, like I'm telling you, because it doesn't mean that these were all in the Mediterranean. Well, there's someone labeled as unidentified. It doesn't mean 100%. I mean, it could have been that they were in a boat somewhere. It doesn't mean, it could have been a person found dead anywhere, but unidentified. And then I asked, has that happened in Malta? And his response was, I guess, like they find a body which is unidentified, I guess. This was followed by a long silence, and I sensed growing frustration. And I was also aware that my assumptions partially were the cause. To be sure, there was confusion and speculation coming from both of our sides of the exchange. And after listening to this conversation and thinking about this interaction again, we were in an encounter at the emotional border. Everything was heightened. The amount of information is limited, and it's highly confusing to try to sort out who is where and when you're referring to bodies as numbers. It depersonalizes it so much and seems to add to the confusion already inherent to the situation. They were speaking really quickly in Maltese and the volume became louder, but eventually we got to some concrete information, thanks to the register. The woman behind the counter was at the computer, and then she looked up and started to speak with me, her head turning back to the computer and back to me over and over. That, quote, there was a body recovered in September 2021. He is buried at the mosque. They must have somehow identified him as being Muslim. 1 November 2021, he was buried at the mosque. I asked, was that body identified? And she said, no. I said, unidentified, but they knew he was Muslim. Yeah, okay. So after some more time, they were looking on the computer and they gave me some more information. But I had more questions, and I became aware that I had more questions than might be possible for them to answer here and now. So I asked sheepishly, is there any way you can share a data set with me about unidentified bodies of migrants who have died and been buried in the cemetery? And they asked, what do you mean, to share the data with you? I said, yes, I wonder if it would be, or if I could send an email to somebody. And she responded, but we don't have anything, days, nothing, not even a name. And then the man responded, we don't know if they were immigrants or whatever. I mean, they were unidentified. That's it. That's the only data we've got. So I asked, so what you're telling me is that the 3 people who died on the 16th of July, 2021 may or may not have been in the Mediterranean, or they definitely were. And he responded, no, they were in the Mediterranean, but they were unidentified. They could have been immigrants. I mean, they could have been. The information of what? And I said, right. I'm just looking to find the place that they're resting. That's all. And then he responded, yes, the ones I gave you last, they're buried over here. This is how I learned that there were not 3, but 4 unidentified bodies in grave 159 at Addolorata. I only learned the numbers of these bodies later when I spoke with Dr. Grima. After this exchange with the context in the burial administration unit, I proceeded to the cemetery. I observed the area of the common graves as being much more organized this year. And I also observed that each of the graves touching grave 159 had some type of item to memorialize the individuals who were there, and that grave 159 had no such items. I sat down next to grave 159. The heat bugs provided an ongoing sound that would stop every once in a while. The sound of traffic then dominated, and the white noise of the heat bugs continued again. I sat there thinking about the confusion and the ambiguity of the situation, the assumptions and the speculation interpreted and imposed on that situation by us in that last exchange. Had this situation been an encounter at the emotional border? I felt something positive in having located these bodies. I felt something had shifted, and that it also changed absolutely nothing at all. My hunch now was that there's something significant about enumeration in terms of memory and the emotional border, that numbers, large numbers specifically, impact people. We really need to understand why a single death means so much less and why multiple deaths register as a tragedy. It's both close and far away, easy and difficult to conceive of, but I think it's part of a process of dehumanization that doesn't allow us to fully process or perceive the reality that presents to some people in border spaces. Is it the same border, or is it? Do multiple deaths reveal something about the border that's difficult to see when compared to a singular death? On my last trip to Addolorata, I went to sit in quiet with unidentified bodies 153, 155, 156, and 157. The 4 unidentified bodies that I learned were buried in the cemetery on my last visit. It was All Saints' Day, the 1st of November. Before heading over to the cemetery, I stopped at a shop that I knew would have candles to place on the graves. This was the first time I walked into the cemetery without stopping at the administration unit first. I knew where I was going, even if I didn't know who I was going there for. I wrote a short blog post for a website associated with the migrations hub we've recently established at ICS. In it, I wrote, I know nothing about them, nothing other than that they're there, and I sat with them in quiet, taking a moment to be there. I still think that they have many things to tell us about the borders, the regime of borders, and about border crossing, even if they can't express those things to us now. I'm still committed to listen to what their stories can tell us, to providing an interpretation and a translation. And I still believe and remain committed to this. Even if I or we or they don't know anything about them or their circumstances of death, which is doubtful. We know the Mediterranean are the most surveilled waters on the planet. The fact of their death, of border crossing deaths, means their unsuccessful passage was paid by their body capital. I contend that this was the sacrifice required by Malta, by the EU for entry. This is what I want to communicate from above ground. It is with this, the equation, that I think borders make sense. This is the logic. This is how I'm making sense of the senselessness of these deaths. And their deaths are representative of border deaths writ large. I wanted to obtain any kind of documentation that I could for these bodies. So after learning that I might be able to do so, I went to the police station in Valletta and contacted Identity Malta by email. This was in November on my third trip to Malta. I entered the police station in Valletta on the evening of the 8th of November, 2022. It didn't seem, when I first spoke with the police officers, that I would leave with anything. But at the end, one of the officers got up from her chair and approached the side of the counter where I'd been standing. And she asked me if I had dates or report numbers, despite the fact that her supervisor had just said I would have to go somewhere else to get this information. Once he left, she came to the counter and within 30 minutes, I left that police station with report numbers, investigators' names, and phone numbers to call them in the morning. I couldn't believe it. I felt a kind of solidarity that was difficult to explain. And I walked back through Valletta that evening, feeling like I just knew I would get those reports. I called up the officers the next day and I did not get anything, but I was told that I could go to Identity Malta to possibly get a death certificate, even though I couldn't get a police report. So I emailed Identity Malta, the public registry, and I went there. I waited with a lot of hope in the reception office, and I was invited into the office of the head of the unit, and two other women, at least one who was in the email chain, came in and we sat down to speak. And it was only now that I started to think I might not walk out of there with anything. So the head of the unit did most of the talking. He was kind and smiled with his eyes. He told me that a DH-35 certificate of death was issued for these bodies. And this meant that they had died in Maltese territorial waters. As I said before, that was within 12 nautical miles of the coast of Malta. They showed me one of the death certificates to prove that they were all blank, that there was no information there, no detail. And he broke it to me that I wouldn't be able to take any of the certificates back with me. But what struck me again was that he said, quote, "There hasn't been one of these for years now, thank God." Before he explained the civil code and then asked me about my research and asked me what was in their minds, we had a long conversation. I couldn't answer that question, of course. Sorry, guys. But we approached something that clarified things for him, I hope. He asked me if, when I returned to Malta, I'd like to give a seminar during their lunch. It was a very strange encounter, but it was extremely cordial. And I tend to take audio notes as a way of debriefing. It's another field note strategy to get back in there. And in this note, I mentioned it was the nicest no that I'd ever gotten. It was so strange. So I'm still a little perplexed by it. But as I've recognized, I don't have details or stories or people willing to share information, even if it isn't much information. I'm still enumerating bodies, listing them in a chart, calling them unidentified body 153, 155, 156, 157. I don't want to give them aliases. They have names. We don't know them. And how does one trace the subject into places and spaces where they're marginal, invisible, and forgettable? There hasn't been a death like this for years, thank God. How do we as researchers approach narratives that erase, cancel what is real? My approach was to listen, to allow, and to think it through, what it means. But now I'll take some time to think through what to do. I take two questions posed by Mimbe very seriously here. Imagining politics as a form of war, we must ask what place is given to life, death, and the human body, in particular the wounded or slain body. How are they inscribed in the order of power? So my initial research question was, what is significant about border deaths in Malta? From this broad question, 4 others unfolded. Why did I choose to look at borders from the perspective of death? How are border deaths treated and understood in Malta? How do border deaths, relate to borders? And what do border deaths reveal about borders? The border is a structure, an institution. And that is that it is rigid but flexible. Borders slow flows but don't stop them entirely. Therefore, it doesn't make sense to look at the border exclusively as a structure, even as a flexible structure. Partially, this is because borders are crossed by people with different resources like passports or capitals, things to offer, things to be exacted by states. And the fact that they're required to do so in different ways tells us a lot about borders. The other reason I think it doesn't make sense to look at borders exclusively as flexible structure is because, as I said, borders move across people. Borders interpolate and react to the border crosser. Borders influence crossing. Border deaths are the result of the contradictory functioning of the border. In Borders That Stay, Move and Expand, Stefan Mao observes, the shifting border could be understood as a reaction by liberal states to the challenge of doing justice to their own liberal ethics and related obligations on the one hand, and on the other, the interest of limiting and controlling migration and mobility. Mao has laid out the contradiction of the border. It secures a liberal zone, but at the cost of, in Elie Sechar's words, a slipping into illiberal leeway in the process. I choose to look at borders from the perspective of death, because to do so is to see something very different than we look at borders from the perspective of the golden visa, or from the perspective of intra-EU mobility, or the perspective of working middle-class passport holders from powerful countries, or from the perspective of the person who migrates extra-legally and makes it. There are parallels and commonalities too between each of these mobilities. But from the perspective of death, the border is a brutal mechanism of strategic and informal domination that seems not to have a limit. The border is a contradiction, but it also seems to possess a logic, an ability to respond, and is in fact responsive. That flexible structure with fixed relationality, a way of categorizing, of sorting and hierarchizing. Let me say it like this. We tend to think of people who migrate differently as different. I think this isn't precise. Their circumstances are different. Their motilities, a la Kaufman, or potential for mobility, spatial or social, are different. The legal regimes that allow, facilitate, or slow their mobility are different. How they're interpolated at borders is different, but all encounter myriad challenges. Negotiate those challenges with what's available to them. But the conditions for crossing are not simply natural challenges. Rather, they're constructed by other humans in various ways and from within the liberal space itself. Legal regimes, visa regimes, passports that facilitate travel, all of this, right? Residence schemes, etc. This is to say, in both physical and metaphysical terms, borders are established at the edges of space and within the territory. Some people encounter the best case scenario, a good case scenario, and the worst case scenario, taking this decision to risk your life or the lives of your loved ones. As Sechar puts it, quote, the brilliance of the shifting border invention lies in its dexterity and ability to do the sorting work of determining who to include and whom to exclude without having to rely on prohibited grounds of discrimination. Following Sechar, the mobility of the border seems to me to operate as a nuanced and next level segregating device. Nuanced and next level because it avoids the traps of markers on which a person may not be discriminated, and has attached itself to new markers, more subtle, more acceptable in both legal and neoliberal terms. The way that border death is treated and understood in Malta exemplifies the normalization of this process I just described. In the encounters and interactions with context while researching deathnography, I was met with many attempts to neutralize the migrant dimension of my research. Again and again, I was reminded that there was not a distinction between migrants and Maltese people, that they were people on their migratory journey didn't matter, that I was focused on something that they were not focused on, and that they were in some way deconstructing my research project. Why was I so intent on this dimension? Why was I so intent on classifying something that doesn't have a classification, or focused on identifying someone who isn't identifiable? Is this how we must square the space of a liberal zone with its constituent outside? Is this how we must make sense of this contradiction? Finally, I think border deaths reveal the importance of bringing the subjective dimension into a study on borders. I was confronted with the fact that the unidentified bodies, 153, 155, 156, and 157 lacked subjectivity that could provide deeper answers about who they were or the borders. But it's also this lacking subjectivity coupled with an intense need for rehumanizing these bodies after their deaths in a way to normalize their deaths that reveals the contradiction, the segregated nature of the regime of borders. This project, by triangulating the subjectivities of those who cross borders, hopefully will expose an interconnectedness between the discourse and practice said to be in the name of rights, security, and protections that exist within that liberal zone at the expense of the zone outside of that. To put it in the words of the representative from the Armed Forces of Malta, no man's land. It belongs to everyone and no one. Or in Sachar's, a law-free zone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Thanks a lot.
Sorry for going over.
A patchwork and ethnography for a patchwork and a border, an experience of the border, of course. Right, so we have roughly 20 minutes for discussion. So I would like to open the floor for any question from the audience. Yeah. And leaving some time for the people to prepare their question. Right. Anyone?
I think we need to say what a wonderful talk it was.
Yeah,
I mean,
it
was really immersive, in so many ways. So I want to, thank you so much for the talk, and also it brought some odd memories of part of the essay that James Clifford had written about in his chapter on traveling cultures. Yes, traveling cultures. There were those, I seem to remember, it's, quite a few years back, I've read it, but there were all those pages about fieldwork. And, I guess it would be interesting to read them again after listening to you, and also, remembering the kind of, fieldwork that has been done by other members of this network as well. So it was super interesting as well in that way. And also, it does follow up on the work presented by Alessandro as well, and the personal and the intimate connection and the thinking that goes into this. So anyway, there wasn't really a question in that, but just a reaction.
Thank you, Judith. It's James Clifford, you said.
Yes, traveling cultures. It's that, first chapter in the book.
Okay.
And it's got, you know, a couple of pages about fieldwork and what he thinks about it. Bidisha, you remember, right?
Yeah.
I mean, those pages, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
There's a question from Elsa in the chat box.
So tourism is one of the most important sources of income. Its beautiful scenery also attracts international film productions, with the film studios are specialized in shipwreck scenes. How Malta presents itself to the rest of the world and is thus very important. How do you think this affects its regime, its border regime? This is a really good point, Elsa. A lot of the time that I spent there, it was like the buzz is this or that film is being made here. I'm thinking of a photo that was shared by Professor Vacchiano, who I cited in some of this, and it was like a photo he took of tourists sort of next to migrants in, I don't know if it was in Malta, but it was in the Mediterranean, certainly. But I think, again, the way in which the experience of the border is so siloed off, how we I think often believe that our experience is the one that dominates. And I think that this for me as part of the project is sharing with people what other experiences of the border can be like. And then I think from there, it just follows logically, like, why is it like this? And does it have to be like this? Because I think it doesn't, or at least I hope it doesn't. Yeah, but it is very strange. Even when I was living there, Angelina Jolie made a trip with UNHCR, and what some of the people told me was that well, there was one refugee camp for families, and this was in Halfar. So it's like a different part of the island, sort of in the southern part of the island, and they came in and they built a playground for the kids. And the kids were so excited about this playground. And then she came in for the photo opportunity. And then what they told me was that they removed the playground after the visit. And I thought that was so strange. But again, it's like this element of image is very, very important in Malta, in that context. Yeah, thank you for that question, Elsa. It's good to see you.
Any other question? Yeah, Félicien?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thanks a lot, Lisa, for your fantastic talk. It was great because we had previous discussion about it before you left when we met in Lisbon last year. So it's fantastic to see how you dealt with all of this personally also, because I know it wasn't easy. It's very nice and very insightful that you share us also all the negotiation you had to do on the fieldwork to turn it viable also, no? Because it's also a matter of how to organize your life with your daughter and so on and so forth. So congratulations for this. And I don't know, there is many aspects we could discuss, but I found the idea of the patchwork ethnography very interesting. The one of deathnography also that you discussed previously also in Oxford. And I was thinking about I don't know, some bridges, some challenges I had also during my research. And I think that this issue about how to deal now with how to research, how to ethnography migrants' deaths, and often in violent contexts, how to position ourselves in front of this death is not easy at all. So it's very nice that you shared with a lot of sensitivity how you were in the cemetery, how you reacted and I don't have a solution. It's like it could be also an open question, because I was wondering often in the cases that I followed some emblematic cases of violent death in Spain and Belgium, and sometimes it was easy for me. It was not easy, sorry, for me to deal with this, to find a balance between to ethnography these days, to respect them, to give them tribute, and sometimes you are so close to this death that to this person that you never met, you don't know their story or only part of it, and you have the impression that you get to know them slowly. So I know in my case, for instance, I have these names, I have this because they were deaths in the Mediterranean, also they were not an unidentified body, so it was a bit different from your case. But I know it could be an open question about how to find this balance, how to deal with this this kind of research. And I was mainly wondering, if I understand well, you really focused on the state as an actor. So we have police administration, cemetery administration, border management administration, and I don't know if maybe we already discussed about it and I forgot. So for this, if you focused also on civil society or other actors, and maybe the last question, and I will stop with this, would be, I would like to know a bit more how you dealt in your thesis with these three main dimensions, no, that you're referring to. So the death of the borders of migrants, and also this privileged migration in the case of golden visa. So I think it's very interesting tension that you highlight, and I just would like to know a bit more about this. So thanks a lot, and yeah.
You're muted, Lisa.
We can't hear.
Sorry, I was, thanks for the question, Felician. I think to maybe open the question, how we position ourselves to the group, or how to deal with this kind of research to the group. But I suppose I can say that, I think that everybody would want or feel the need to do something different. I think so long as it's authentic, I think it makes sense. You know, I think for some people, maybe, for everyone, death means something different, and also the not knowing or having, had some type of interaction with a person in life, but still acknowledging their death in an authentic way. I think that would be how I would answer that question. In terms of engaging civil society or other actors, so I've done some interviews with I'm calling them experts, but it's people in Malta who their professional life intersects with migration. But I had the chance to interview an artist the last time that I was there, and I will do some. I will use some of her art as well in another project. And then the question of the three dimensions. So I'm using those three dimensions as, parts of the experiential border. Obviously, it's not limited to that. It's there's as many experiences as there are border crossers, but I think that the categorization matters quite a bit. And I guess the idea is that the object of my study is still the border, but I'm using those the different subjectivities to sort of get at how different this can look. And the idea of segregation, I think, is that we talk about this thing as if it's one thing, but my point is that it's not one thing. It matters a lot who it is that engages the structure, and I think that is very essentially what we're talking about when we talk about segregation. Yeah.
Thank you, Lisa.
Just a comment from Jane in the chat. Suppose you can all see it. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. Just a remark, I think Alice Smith's novel Spring depicts a character that works at an immigration removal center and a schoolgirl who goes there one day and tries to break the rules, shaming the director into having bathrooms clean, breaching security. I just thought it echoes something I think you have said about flexibility, willingness to break rules, even if the novel does not deal with border death directly. So yeah, some food for thought. And Yumna has a question. And Yumna, you need to open your mic.
First of all, I think all of us are sick here with a virus in this forum. Luckily, it's online. It shows so much of Tuma, especially Tuma.
I confirm.
Yeah. But, thank you so much for this talk, Lisa. It's like a question with a remark. So far, based on my interaction with this forum of Thanatic ethics and most of the people I know and researchers who work on the topic, has some personal aspect. The research started with a personal experience, with a personal anecdote. And I think this is one of the things that we struggle with. Where do we position ourselves here? How objective we are, since it started with a personal. And I started to pay attention to this after Alexander talk, when he talked about using art in Lampedusa to help him deal with his research. And now we have you. So I'm happy we are talking about it, because we all share some conflicting moments about what to say, what not to say, what to include, what not to include. Are we being reasonable here or not? And where is our position as a person in comparison or par rapport researcher? And I'm happy you brought it up, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Yumna. I think that I think you're right that it is very personal for most of us on some level, and it's not something necessarily to shy away from. I think for myself, I'm waiting. I'm not sure. I just did something here. There we go. I'm waiting to feel ready. You know.
Actually, I have to say the forum of Thanatic ethics and my writings made me or helped me come to term. And actually the research and the personal experience were connected. And actually the last article that I just shared on our network is when I was writing the conclusion that I realized something about my personal experience in this research. So I find them in a way can complement each other, and it's a process when the researcher could bring his own personal experience with death and talk about it. So maybe by the end of your PhD, a chapter will be on your personal.
I think so too.
Indeed. Thank you. And it also echoes with talks we had in Calcutta as well. Okay, so this webinar is coming to an end. I'm really sorry. It's been a wonderful presentation and a great talk. Maybe Judith, you want to say something about the upcoming workshop, or it's okay?
Well, just that, you know, you have I mean, people can find the call for papers on the website. I mean, if you go to, you know, workshops and call for papers, etc. I mean, upcoming events. And it will be, you know, co-organized, co-convened and co-organized with Günel as well, and in partnership with the American College of the Mediterranean. And also co-organized with Sid Bolton and Katriana Jarvis, so who are now, you know, project team members and who joined the network in Oxford when they came and presented for the first time. So there is something that is more. There is a, you know, heightened component or dimension that would be legal. But not only, obviously. So it does cover as well all the other, you know, disciplines and fields we are used to working in and from. So, you know, don't shy away because it's got this legalistic appearance about it, but it's just as much about the arts and the humanities as well as, you know, any other, you know, discipline. So
the main theme is accountability.
yes. Yes. Okay.
Yes. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, and for coming and participating. And we'll see you next time. When's the date? Oh gosh,
March
24th?
17th.
Sorry.
March 17th.
March 17th.
Yeah,
for
which
the
is
next
also
webinar.
Friday.
Yeah, you will receive some news about that.
With
Of course.
Robin. Yeah, you'll receive, yeah, abstracts and everything.
Thank
Get
you.
well tomorrow
Okay.
weekend. Get well.
Yeah,
Thank
merci,
you. Thank you
merci.
again, Lisa. Thank you.
For the
Bye.
month.
Bye.
Bye.